Uh, we're going to be talking about straw bale gardening today, which is a nice alternative to some of our traditional gardening methods. So we will go ahead and get started. Let's see if my clicker works here. It always is slow, like on the first slide. Okay, there we go. So what is straw bale gardening? So as I said, it's kind of an alternative to traditional gardening. Another form of container gardening is a way you could look at it. A variety of vegetables can be grown in straw bales without needing to dig in the soil. So this is an easy way to create a kind of a raised bed, and it makes it easier to care and harvest for plants. It saves your back. And at the end of the season, what's kind of cool about it is that you can continue to use these bales and that they can be recycled and added to your compost or add to your garden. So you get multiple uses out of them. Sometimes you can get 2 years out of them, but when I say you get multiple uses, using them not only to grow things one year, but then putting back in that organic matter to your garden or compost pile the next year. So I was trying to figure out how's the best way to describe how this all works. And I had a couple of different things that I found online, different extension pubs, and then ways I tried to explain it. And then I thought this one from Illinois Extension says it best. So straw bale gardening is essentially growing your garden produce in a working compost pile. The science behind the decomposition of the straw bale is what makes it ideal for growing vegetables. Nitrogen and water added to the straw bale through fertilization feeds bacterial growth to create green manure, and then the bacterium then break down the straw, releasing those nutrients. So that's in a nutshell what is going to be happening inside those straw bales in order to produce, so you can actually grow vegetables in these straw bales. So materials needed. We obviously, as it says, straw bale, you need a straw bale, and I'll go into more detail about all of these as we go through the PowerPoint, just kind of overview right here. But you have fertilizer, T-post, which are optional, it depends on your setup, and we'll talk about that. A soaker hose, I would highly recommend one of those. Hand trowel, a soil knife. I preferred a soil knife for this project versus a hand trowel. A potting soil, and maybe you would like some landscape fabric, newspaper, or pallets, and that's going to come in handy when we do setup and keeping weed pressure down. Okay, so first thing you obviously need if you're going to do straw bale gardening is a straw bale. You want straw bales that are going to be held tightly with twine. You can use old bales. They will work, but make sure that the strings are really tight, because you don't want anything to be loose, because then they'll just kind of completely fall apart on you. Or if it's already started to break down, that's not going to be a great growing environment for them. And find out where the straw came from. So I say this because we've had incidents before where if things have been treated with herbicide, that might have lingered on that straw, or they might spread to your desirable plants that you were planting. So know where you're getting your straw from. And actually, people always ask, like, where do you buy it? If you don't know a local farmer to purchase it from, so it's usually southern states. And yesterday I was near Lowe's, and I drove past Lowe's, and I had a semi-truckload of straw bales, probably for most people getting them for their fall decoration at this time. But one thing we want to make sure that we avoid is hay. So that straw is going to be wheat or oats. It's the stem, of different grain crops where the grain has been harvested off and it's the stems left over. But hay, it's going to have, a mixture of grasses in it that could have seed heads on it, and you don't want to end up just growing those seed heads as you condition your bale to get ready for planting. So when it comes to location, we want to do 6 hours of full sun or more. We just don't think about like your regular vegetable garden, or like if you were installing a raised bed, where would you put it? Close to a water source. This is very important. I always say with just general gardening, you want to have it close to a water source, because who wants to carry buckets of water in 90-degree weather to the back of their property? Nobody wants to do that for a regular garden, for raised beds, for container gardens. And then these guys are going to take a lot of water. Things tend to dry out quickly with them. So you're going to want to make sure that you're close to a water source. You want to avoid slopes, just because of draining. These bales will get heavy once they get saturated with water. You don't want them possibly tipping over on you. If you are on a slope, place the bales with the slope and not horizontally along the slope. That will prevent them from tipping. Placing them on concrete, gravel, great locations, wooden pallets. Some people like to place them up off the ground on pallets. But if you're placing them on the lawn, it's a good idea to place newspaper down first to suppress weeds so that it doesn't grow all the way up around them. You could mulch and place them on the mulch or use some landscape fabric. Put that down first and then place your bales on top of that. Now, when it comes to placing the bales, you want to make sure that the cut end of the bale is facing up. And I have another picture of that'll show you versus the cut end versus the folded over end with just how it goes through the baler. This will make it easier for the fertilizer and water to move through the bale. And I'll explain, like, I have pictures and I'll explain all this because it might not make sense when I keep talking about like how the water is going to move through and what we're going to be doing with these square bales. But make sure you like them where they're at, because once they are saturated with water, they're going to become extremely heavy and you're not going to want to move them around. A lot of people do designs with them. Think about placing them at least 3 to 4 feet apart, just so you have adequate room to walk through with maybe a wheelbarrow or something else to get through them. I mean, this picture here, they're kind of close to each other, but if you're fine with that, with just working from them from the outside, that works. But if you want to, be able to get through them with a wheelbarrow, do about 3 to 4 feet apart. And also we want to think about a T-post or rebar. And this is going to be, so if you are on a slope, you can stake it into the ground to supply some support behind them when they get heavy if they're on a slope. Also, even if you're not on a slope, just to supply a little more support. And I have some pictures of ones that I did here at the office, but I was able to place mine up against a fence for support. So here's that picture I was talking about where you can see the 2 different sides of the bale. So you're going to want to flip your bale over to the side on the left, where you can see the hollows of the stems. And this is going to allow water and fertilizer to drain better through the bale versus on the other side. And you can just see how it's flattened. Things are not going to drain through that side as easily as they are on one on the left. Okay, so I actually did this back in 2015. So right when I first started working here in our little demonstration garden that we have at our office, I actually just got some straw bales from my dad. So you'll see that it wasn't necessarily clean straw bales that I have in some other pictures coming up, but so 3 straw bales, and I didn't put T-post out or any other supporting structures just because I had that fence that I could lean them up against. So to start the process of getting these bales ready to plant in, we do something called bale conditioning. So this is where it's going to prep them to have that nice fertility in there to grow plants. So I have a chart that'll show you days to go by, and you can find all different ones all across. There's all sorts of other great extension pubs out there that have all different kinds of recommendations for these bale conditionings. We actually, Boyd County, Lori Bolin, one of our other horticulture agents here in Kentucky, has a nice little publication on straw bale gardening as well. And so she has a chart listed of different bale conditioning, different ways to condition your bale. And there's a few other extension publications that have different ones as well, different days and steps. This is what worked for me, and I ended up being able to grow some produce in here. So days 1 through 3, I watered the bales. I watered them until I could see water flowing out the bottom of them. And like I said, I made sure this is where I wanted to put them. I tried to move them just out of curiosity, but didn't try to move them to new locations, but just picked them up, and they definitely get heavy. So you want to keep them where they're at. And the bale should start to decompose and start to warm up. So it was pretty funny when I first started working here, and I had these square bales out there, the straw bales, and people would drive up to the office and there's their new horticulture agent just sitting there watering straw bales, So it was kind of funny at first when people were like, what on earth are you doing? So days 4 through 6, we start to add nitrogen to it. So I just used, a traditional fertilizer. So I used urea, and about 1/2 cup of that, I sprinkled it, and you can kind of see it in the picture over the top of the bales. And then I would water it in. So you can use fertilizers. You can use other fertilizers and organic ones. The organic fertilizers you're going to want to use at a higher rate. And there's some that blood meal, feather meal, there's some that you want to stay away from, like fish meal. It'll work, but I'll explain a little bit about that and the disadvantages, why you might want to stay away from that one. But water them well after the fertilizer application, and this will start to speed up your decomposition process. But you don't want to water them at this point to where they're going to be leaking out the bottom anymore. So, but just, they're well saturated. So days 7 through 9, you start to cut the nitrogen in half. And then, like I said, you don't want to overly water. You want to just keep them moist, because at this point you've added all that nitrogen for your plants, and you want to keep that from leaching out the bottom. And this could lead to runoff. So what did I say? A half a cup of nitrogen. So I went to a quarter cup of nitrogen that I was sprinkling on every day those days. And then I was going and watering them. But by day 10, I stopped at adding fertilizer, and then I just kept the bales moist. It was also beneficial that some of those days it rained, so I didn't have to worry about going out there and watering them. So day 11, I went out and I went to feel the bales for heat to see if it's that decomposition process is going on. So you check the temperature. So I used a meat thermometer to place it inside the bale to see what our temperature is at. So you want it to be below 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything above that, it's going to be too hot for you to plant in. So you can also just put your hand inside the bale and feel for the heat. And if it's too warm for you to keep your hand in there, then it's too warm to put to start planting or seed plants in there. So you want to just make sure that it's below that 99 degrees. And then if it's above it, you might wait a day or two and see if your bale has cooled some. So once the bale is cool, below that temp, then you can start planting. So it's about 2 to 3 weeks after the conditioning process begins, you can start planting in those straw bales. So here's just a table of kind of everything that I just talked about. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of extension pubs out there who have like really nice, other nice tables that go through different conditioning processes by individual days, by, with other types of fertilizer. Some suggest to water every day, some don't water every day, but this is what worked for me. And you'll see my results coming up here. So days 1 through 3, no fertilizer, just soak those bales. 4 through 6, sprinkle a half a cup of that traditional fertilizer. And I just use nitrogen. And again, that worked for me, but I know like in a couple of other places, they suggest using, adding like some lime or adding other combinations of fertilizer together on there, but this worked well for me, what I was doing. So water in fertilizer, that's days 7 through 9, cut the amount of traditional fertilizer to a quarter cup. Organic, we start with those 3 cups, so we're going to go to a cup and a half. Water, but not excessively. Day 10, stop fertilizing, but just make sure those bales stay moist. And day 11, you start to check your temperature. So in that final day 12. So, it can take a little longer, I think, kind of weather dependent and how things are going on. But, it was like, for me personally, within those 12 days, I could start planting in those bales. So that doesn't take, a long amount of time. And you have to think also with like, this is at this point, it's pretty inexpensive. I know that, you build a raised bed, you can use it for several years, but the upfront cost might, be a little too much for somebody. Or if you're, say, maybe renting a place, or, you don't want to put a more permanent structure there, these straw bales are a good alternative. So when it comes to planting, we have 2 options that people do. Pocket planting and flatbed planting. And here's just and I have pictures of those coming up of what those look like. So pocket planting, as you might guess, you're creating a pocket within the bale, 3 to 4 inches deep, and you loosen the straw. A lot of people say use a trowel, a little hand trowel to dig in there. I used a soil knife. I thought that worked really well because it able to let me saw a little bit of the straw out of the way. And then you fill the pockets with some growing media. So your traditional potting soil that you would buy for planting any of your annual flowers or any other vegetable plants, that's what you could put in there. And you can put transplants in, and I did both transplants and direct seeded some items that went in the bale. And as you can see, as I mentioned, I just went home one week and was like, hey, I need some straw bales. And my dad had straw bales, but they were not necessarily all free of the wheat seed. So I did have a nice crop of wheat as well that I grew on my straw bales. And we had little tiny transplants that someone gave me, I believe, from the high school, but those little tiny pepper plants there, but cut into the bales, fill them with the soil, and transplant in. So I was able to get at least 3 pepper plants in here, and that ended up being enough space for when they were larger as well. Okay, flatbed planting is spreading the soil on top of the bale, at least 2 to 4 inches deep, moistening it before you start to seed, and then direct seed or transplant it. And with these, I just ended up direct seeding. I didn't transplant anything into these, and just direct seeded them to see how, they were going to take off and the roots would go down through those bales. So that's what it looked like when I first, finished planting everything, and after I did the bale conditioning. And I did cucumbers. And so this one I had, I think I had cucumbers and melons as well. But I did the seeds, and I kind of overseeded just because I was like, I didn't know at first, how this was going to work. And I figured that I could just, thin things out later. But I direct seeded there on the left, you can see, and then the other top was that flatbed seeding, and everything popped up quickly. So this is 6 weeks after planting. I also, in the center there, did some tomato plants, and those peppers on the left, and then those melons on the right, cucumbers, and there was a melon, I think, on the right. And then my wheat that was growing at the bottom, but I would just come back and like trim that off every once in a while. And they took off. So this is later in the summer, my tomato plants, which I'll talk more about what you can do, more maintenance that can occur with them. As you can see, we have some other weedy stuff coming up, but you can definitely grow some big tomato plants in straw bales. So kind of what you can plant in them. Green beans are an excellent thing to plant in the straw bales. I would say refer to your package to see spacing for those. Cantaloupe, cucumbers, you might want to do trellising with those guys. Lettuce, refer to your packet what it says of spacing. Pepper plants do well. Pumpkins, summer squash, winter squash. Keep in mind with those winter squash and even like the pumpkins with trailing, those vines going out. And then tomatoes, I found did extremely well in these. Things that you want to kind of avoid are some of your root crops, like your carrots. You don't really want to put those in the straw bales versus these other crops that we have available. So when it comes to maintenance, I think the biggest issue, the most thing is water. So the water moves out of the straw quickly. So when we get dry periods, you're going to have to be out there watering a lot. A way to solve that is hooking up a drip irrigation or a soaker hose that you could put along the bales, like in this picture here. I did not have that at the time, and so just trying to remember to go out there and water them quite often. Plastic containers, kind of like what we do with trees and stuff. I've seen where people have poke holes in like the lid of a container, place the container upside down about 1 inch away from the plant, and let it drain out that way to help water. So you're not having to water the entire bale, but you're trying to hit that plant's like root system. And then also people will fertilize that way as well. But water is probably the biggest challenge, I would say, with these. So if you go on a vacation or anything, you want to make sure your neighbor or whoever you have taken knows the commitment for keeping your straw bales well watered if it's in the dry period. Fertilizer is the next biggest issue, I think, with these guys, is that we get a lot of nutrients are lost from leaching from all the watering. Nitrogen deficiency is very common when we see the yellowing of the leaves of the plant. You want to use a complete fertilizer to fertilize your vegetable plants. You can use an organic or an inorganic, like a complete, like a triple 10, and liquid soluble put on there. I wouldn't apply necessarily more of a slow release fertilizer. I would just do a liquid soluble. And I should have said that too with the when you do the initial bale conditioning, not to use a slow release fertilizer. You want to use one that's going to dissolve quickly in water. And you can apply your fertilizer at least once a month. You might end up doing a second shot of fertilizer as well if you notice things are not greening up. So staking, what I should have probably done with my tomatoes and peppers that I grew, but they luckily leaned up against the fence. But when you have some of these larger plants, putting stakes out there not only to hold them, but also to help, hold up the bale and also hold up the plants. So with tomatoes, it might be a better option to use a determinate variety versus an indeterminate one. So they're not going to keep that whole vining. Granted, you get like most of your tomatoes all at once, but still, you're not going to have to worry about trying to string something up. Like I said, using T-post, rebar to stabilize the bale, and you can use trellis to help with some of these vining crops. So with those cucumbers or squash, winter squash, to run those vines up. So with weeds and insects, usually weed free. Grass or wheat may germinate, like what happened in mine, but just keep removing it, and it wasn't really an issue. If you see mushrooms, your decomposition is working, so it's not a bad sign to see mushrooms, but you just want to go ahead and remove them when you do see them. Sometimes they can affect the seed germinating. I was reading up on some of that about some of the mushrooms can do that, but what we always tell everybody at UK is do not consume mushrooms that you just find out in your landscape. So do not consume those mushrooms that you pick off of there. Attend one of our other, mushroom classes and find out how to grow your own safe mushrooms to eat. Ground dwelling insects are less of a problem. So bells are elevated, prevent insects like cutworms. Insect life cycles get disrupted because you are going to take this apart and compost it. So they're not going to really overwinter there unless you're going to try to get 2 years out of these. We have prevents a lot of soil-borne diseases, but you can still get some of our foliar ones. We'll see on them just like, from being close together. So you may want to, not over plant in your bale because, we always want to have good air movement so water can dry quickly on those leaves and prevent disease being spread around. So some advantages and disadvantages of doing straw bale gardening. Bales are 2 feet tall, so accessible gardening. And, I'm all about like doing something that's going to like save your back and not, work smarter, not harder. They're not permanent. So it's great for if you're renting or if you're not really committed to installing a raised bed in a certain place. You can move them around, different locations. Straw can be used as mulch or added to a compost pile at the end of the season. So that's a major benefit of these. No digging or soil prep. Bales can be placed on concrete or pavement, and it's an inexpensive raised bed garden. So like I said, if you're not ready to commit to installing raised beds, or if maybe you can't, depending on where you live, this is a nice alternative. So disadvantages can be you can attract unwanted rodents when placed too close to the home. They can get in there, especially I was reading up on them. If you use fish meal, that has a tendency to attract some critters. So from the smell of it, and they can destroy your bale, or they can also get into other things around your house. The biggest thing that I mentioned is watering. That's the biggest challenge if you don't place them in an area where it's easy to get water to, or you have a soaker hose hooked up to, because rehydration of the bales is very difficult to do. Nearby runoff may be absorbed through the bale or have adverse effects on your plant, depending on what maybe lawns are treated with, or where they're located. Runoff can occur and you might end up having some not so happy plants. So and finally, recycle. So that's what's also really cool about this is that bales last for about a year. They say you can get 2 years out of them, but time it got to fall with mine. Mine were ready to be put in the compost pile. They were done for the year. They can be used as mulch and beds, pathways, compost pile, or incorporate them back in the soil to add more organic matter to your garden. So that's what I have on raised bed, not raised beds, straw bale gardening. And there's a lot of other great resources out there. I should have put a slide in there, but like I mentioned that, Boyd County Horticulture, they had a publication on straw bale gardening. Clemson has a great publication on there, and quite a few other extension offices or extension services do with different bale conditioning charts. So just to find out which one works best for you, which your personal preference, if you're using the traditional fertilizer or an organic fertilizer, or how much you want to put into it, or how little you want to put into it, to see which one works best for you. So I think that's all that I have for today on this topic.